Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this special and interesting webinar. At a time of resurgence of anti-Semitism, this webinar is most timely. It offers to remember the best of humanity while shedding light on the largely unknown tragedy that after surviving the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, many descendants of SEFARAD once again fell victim to the worst humanity has to offer and were largely annihilated by the Nazis. The few that survived were saved by remarkable individuals that we consider the righteous among the nations. While Jewish Heritage Alliance webinars tend to focus on medieval and early modern time periods, we decided to bring to the fore these 20th century events. This webinar will pay homage to the several of these heroes. A few program notes before we get started. So we don't use on this webinar, we don't use the chat button. We ask that you please send your questions and comments to the Q&A button on your screen. Our speakers will try to address your questions at the Q&A session at the end of the event. We will email responses to questions we are not able to cover today. So now let's get started. My name is Michael Steinberger. I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a platform dedicated to preserve and promote the legacy of SEFARAD on a global scale. I would like to acknowledge and thank today's co-sponsors for helping us make this event possible. I would like to thank Comunidad Israelita do Porto, or the Jewish community of Porto in Portugal. I would also like to thank the Sue and Leonard Miller Center and the George Feldenkrais programs in Judaic Studies at the University of Miami. I would also like to acknowledge and thank today's co-hosting partners for helping us make this event a success. I would like to thank Anu Museum of the Jewish People, previously Beta Tutzot, Temple Moses of Miami, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, Kulanu, our friends at WZO, the Jewish Learning Channel, Reconnectar, Tourist Synagogue of Newport in Rhode Island, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, Gratz College, and the European Jewish Community Center. I would also like to acknowledge our alliance and affiliate members consisting of global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors that together create a voice of the collective, allowing us to broaden our scope and expand our reach. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce Mr. Hugo Vaz, a native of Porto, a trained educator with degrees in archaeology and museum studies from the University of Porto. He has coordinated Porto's community cultural department while serving as curator of both the Jewish and Holocaust museums in Porto. Take it away, Hugo.
Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. First of all, I want to thank the Jewish Heritage Alliance and Mr. Steinberger for the Herculean work you have done in bringing the attention in exploring and opening up the Sephardic legacy to debate. Today's webinar talks about the connection between SEFARAD and the Sephardic diaspora communities to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. And this relation is precisely what we actually do here in Porto. In our Jewish Museum of Porto, we focus on the Jewish community in the Iberian Peninsula, in SEFARAD, and then the several Sephardic diaspora communities. Many of them, as we will speak later, were touched by the Holocaust, and this subject is also addressed here in the Holocaust Museum of Porto, where I am at the moment. By the way, this museum has just celebrated its second anniversary and already has almost 100,000 visitors, mainly school students. And all through several Holocaust-related topics are addressed here. Our educational services manage their program always around the writers among the nations in order to encourage our public to follow their actions today, basically to fight anti-Semitism. That's why it's also so important, these events. And once again, I want to thank the Jewish Heritage Alliance for their work. Well, I am absolutely sure that today's event will be amazing, and we will have the opportunity to learn interesting facts from our magnificent and very capable guests. So I want to thank the presence of you all. Thank you.
Thank you for the welcoming remarks, and thank you for the acknowledgements. Appreciate it a lot. And now allow me to introduce our very own Dr. Isaac Amon, Director of Academic Research and Program Development at the Jewish Heritage Alliance, who will provide a brief background of today's webinar and introduce today's speakers. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone wherever you may be for today's webinar, SEFARAD in the Garden of the Righteous. This year marks 78 years since the end of World War II, the most appalling and destructive conflict in human history. Between 70 to 85 million human beings were killed around the world in violent ways, ranging from the battlefields of Europe to atomic bombs in Japan. Amidst this global maelstrom of death and destruction, Nazi Germany pathologically pursued and nearly achieved a singular and sinister objective: the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of European Jewry, which we refer to as the Holocaust, Shoah, or Korban. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, from the Netherlands to Greece and France to the Soviet Union, thousands of vibrant Jewish communities, big and small, were extirpated. By May 1945, when Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany, the extent of the depravity was uncovered. 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of global Jewry, or 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children, had been massacred. Traditional study of the Holocaust has long focused on the Ashkenazi Jewish presence across Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, devastated by the genocide. There has been good reason for this emphasis, as many of these communities, ranging from the urban areas of Warsaw, Krakow, Łódź, and Vilna to small villages and shtetls dotted across the landscape of Eastern Europe, were almost wholly eradicated in ghettos by famine and disease or by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile SS death squads. Until recently, almost no attention has been paid to ancient, prosperous, and long-settled Sephardic communities, which were targeted by the Nazis for destruction as well. Indeed, even today, the story of SEFARAD and the Shoah is still largely and lamentably relegated to the margins. However, as is increasingly clear, the Holocaust was more than a purely Ashkenazi event, for the scope encompassed not only mainland Europe, but the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Levant, all former parts of the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, Jewish-born subjects of the Ottoman sultans numbered among the 6 million Jewish victims, including my grandfather's uncle, Leon Cohen, born in Istanbul, deported from Drancy, France to Auschwitz in 1943, where he perished. Where and when had these Sephardic Jews come from? Following the 1492 Alhambra decree, or Spanish edict of expulsion, proclaimed by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the unity of Sepharad was splintered and a global diaspora began. As the map depicts, the tens of thousands of Iberian exiles took different migration routes. Half entered the neighboring kingdom of Portugal, while the other half left Iberia and went to North Africa, principally Morocco, journeyed across the Mediterranean to the Italian peninsula, led by Don Isaac Abravanel, the financier, Portuguese statesman, and scion of the House of David, or settled across the Levant and Balkans, lands that were or would soon come under Ottoman control. They included Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Greece, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and Albania. In 1497, the Portuguese King Manuel I acquiesced to Spanish demands and issued an edict expelling Jews from his dominions, yet he eventually ended up forcibly converting them all at once. The entire normative Jewish community in Portugal thus became new Christians or conversos overnight, yet their crypto-Jewish rites and rituals proved resilient and tenacious, becoming impossible to ever fully eradicate. In subsequent decades and centuries, these Portuguese new Christians found refuge in places where their Spanish brethren and former co-religionists had gone before, whereupon the newcomers reverted to their ancestral faith. They also found refuge in Northern Europe, including Germany, the Netherlands, and England. Less well known is that of Denmark. In 1622, King Christian IV invited Spanish and Portuguese Jews from Hamburg and Germany and Amsterdam in the Netherlands to settle in Gluckstadt, a port and trading center, assuring them freedom of religion. In 1657, when Jews were allowed by Oliver Cromwell to resettle in England, Danish King Frederick III permitted the, quote, Portuguese professing the Hebrew religion to freely trade and travel. By the 1930s and 1940s, Jewish communities, including well-settled and integrated Sephardim, had lived in these countries for several centuries, if not millennia. This long history came to play a key role, including in Denmark, where 99% of Danish Jewry was saved, as we shall see, due to the German diplomat George Ferdinand Dukvith and the leadership of King Christian X, who wrote in his diary that all Danes would wear the Star of David if Jews were compelled to do so. In other lands, Jews constituted major proportions of urban areas like Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Salonika in southeastern Europe. Unfortunately, the end result there was a tragedy, not a triumph. In Bosnia, there were about 14,000 Sephardic Jews, 12,000 of whom lived in the capital, Sarajevo, speaking Ladino, the medieval Spanish mixed with Greek, French, Turkish, Arabic, and Italian. They accounted for up to 20% of the city population. They also possessed the magnificent Sarajevo Haggadah, comprised of 142 leaves of parchment featuring illuminated biblical scenes. Already nearly 600 years old, it was composed in Barcelona around 1350, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims still lived in the Sol y Sombra, the sun and shadow of a shared existence. In 1492, Iberian exiles brought this Haggadah with them, and by the late 19th century, this codex wound up in Sarajevo. And the Holocaust, it was saved by Dervis Korkut, an Islamic scholar and curator of the Bosnian National Museum. Sephardic Jews, along with Serbs and Roma, were murdered by the Ustaša, the independent state of Croatia, under the leadership of Hitler's ally Ante Pavelić. 86% of the Sephardic community was murdered. Today, a few hundred Jews remain, and with the death in October 2022 of Shoah survivor Morris al-Bahari, age 93, perhaps only a final few Ladino speakers live there. In the 4th century BCE, the city of Salonika, or Thessaloniki in Greek, was founded by King Cassander after his wife, the sister of the famed conqueror of classical antiquity, Alexander the Great. Since early in its storied history, Jews have constituted a part of the population. In the 1st century CE, the Apostle Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, preached the messianic claims of Jesus of Nazareth across the Greco-Roman Mediterranean to Jew and Gentile alike. The book of Acts in the New Testament records that Paul spoke in the main synagogue in Thessaloniki on 3 different Shabbats, or Sabbaths. In the 12th century, the celebrated Sephardic traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, recorded 500 Jews lived there and were already famous for their scholarship. Yet the extraordinary grandeur of Thessaloniki in the annals of Jewish history did not fully arise until the Sephardic arrival in the late 15th century. Following the Alhambra decree of 1492, tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews converged on this city on the shores of the Aegean Sea, joining Romaniot or Byzantine Jews who'd been there for centuries, and Ashkenazim who began to arrive in the 1370s, fleeing persecution in the Holy Roman Empire. Over succeeding decades and centuries, the Spanish and later Portuguese arrivals reshaped the cosmopolitan city so extensively that it became the religious and cultural hub known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans, and in Ladino as the Mother of Israel, or the Madre de Israel. Over 30 synagogues, each named for their place of origin, including Gerush Sefarad, Castilla, Aragon, Calabria, Yashan, Monasterlis, Apulia, and Portugal, coexisted. And in this very city, the 17th century false messiah Shabbatai Tzvi proclaimed he was the long-awaited for Redeemer. By the late 19th century, Jews constituted more than half of the city population. And even in the 20th century, the port ceased operations on Shabbat, as the majority of the workers were Jewish, while Ladino was commonly spoken throughout the city. Upon the Nazi arrival in April 1941, 50,000 Sephardic Jews called it home. In March 1943, deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau began, and by summer 1943, the entire community had virtually all perished at the death camp. Coming from a warmer climate and speaking Ladino, not Yiddish, most Greek Jews were heartbreakingly isolated even from other Jews. Less than 2,000 Jews from Thessaloniki, or 4%, survived the Holocaust. This remnant included a young man, Moise, and a young woman, Sarah, who became the parents of Albert Bourla, the current CEO of Pfizer. Only about 1,200 Jews live there today. The Mother of Israel, Madre de Israel, had lasted for 450 years. It was destroyed in less than 30 months. Over 80% of Greek Jews were murdered, one of the highest death rates. The glory that was Jewish Greece and the grandeur that was Thessaloniki exists only in memory. The pathological Nazi hatred of Jews continued, so that even by summer 1944, where the Allies were rapidly advancing, the Nazis nonetheless diverted resources and personnel from the war front so more Jews could be deported to the death camps. Indeed, the last remaining intact Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities were deported to Auschwitz nearly simultaneously. Immediately after Jews in Budapest were transported there, the Nazis rounded up and deported small yet ancient and flourishing Sephardic and Romaniot communities on several Greek islands, including Corfu and Leros, in the Ionian Sea and in the Aegean Sea from Chios, Crete, Kos, and Rhodes, where Jews have been present since the Maccabees, and a mere 11 miles from neutral Turkey. In September 1944, the final convoy of Dutch Jews, some of whom were descended from the Portuguese New Christians, were deported to Auschwitz, including the diarist Anne Frank and her family. The story of the Jews in Athens was different thanks to key individuals. The 700,000 Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in North Africa and the Levant were saved in part due to timing and geography. The Allied invasions of North Africa and growing military triumphs over the Nazis, symbolized by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's victory in Egypt over Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942, a mere 250 miles from the Suez Canal, was decisive. It ended any Nazi plans for Jews not yet in their grasp, including in the Holy Land. It's nonetheless estimated that the Nazis murdered close to 50% of Sephardic Jewry in Europe, descendants of Sefarad, who survived expulsions and inquisitions, annihilating a world civilization. A Ladino song expresses the magnitude of the calamity. I would like to write my remembrances, but I would need a sea of ink and a sky for the paper. Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the Holocaust, is dedicated to preserving the memory of the murdered Jews and honoring Jews who fought against their Nazi oppressors. Principal duty is to convey the gratitude of the state of Israel and the Jewish people to the righteous among the nations, a small minority and a remarkable group of people who mustered extraordinary courage to uphold basic human values amid a world of mass inhumanity. In so doing, they took great personal risks to save Jewish men, women, and children. These people, like Aristides de Sousa Mendes of Portugal, Selahattin Ulukumen of Turkey, Archbishop Damaskinos of Athens, and Princess Alice of Greece, King Charles's paternal grandmother, are, as Golda Meir said, drops of love in an ocean of poison. Their names deserve to be remembered, for as ancient Jewish tradition says, one who saves a human life saves an entire universe. With this background, it's now my honor to introduce Mark Brody, the moderator for today's conversation. He's a cultural historian who holds a BA from the University of British Columbia, an MA from NYU's Institute of French Studies, and a PhD in history and visual studies from USC. He has been a visiting fellow at the American Library in Paris, a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, and a National Endowment for the Humanities public scholar. He is the author of Kiki Man Ray, The Invisible Emperor, and Making Monte Carlo. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Isaac. It is my great pleasure to be speaking with you today alongside my friend and colleague, Richard Hurwitz. Richard is someone who moves with great success and skill in many worlds, including being the founder and publisher of the Octavian Report, a journal of ideas. He's a graduate of Columbia and of Yale. His own journalism has appeared really everywhere you could think of: the New York Times, Times of London, Jerusalem Post, many others. And now this staggering debut in the Garden of the Righteous. Some of the early praise for the book has come from public figures. I'm thinking of Abe Foxman, Director Emeritus of the ADL, Bernard-Henri Lévy, the eminent French philosopher, both effusive in their praise, but also some really glowing endorsements from masters of the nonfiction form, including the Pulitzer Prize winner Stacy Schiff and the National Book Award winner Nathaniel Philbrick, who are both perennial bestsellers. And I mention that because I think it really tees up what's so special about Richard's project is that, of course, this is a public document, a testament to these lives and actions that we are at risk of forgetting, and it serves a public function for the greater good. But also, let's not forget that this book offers all of the things that we should expect from nonfiction of the highest grade, which is meticulous research, crafted into really dramatic and gripping prose. Of course, these stories are heartbreaking, but they're also, I find, exceptionally thoughtfully rendered and ultimately life-affirming. So all of which is to say, thank you, Richard, for this generous book, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. Before we get started, I did want to thank Mark, first of all, you for being in conversation. It's an honor, given how wonderful a writer you are. And I wanted to thank Michael and Isaac and everyone from the Jewish Heritage Alliance for having me today to talk about the righteous among the nations, particularly as it affected the Sephardic community.
Wonderful. And let me add my thanks as well. And my task today will be to keep us on time and leave ample time for us to hear your questions toward the end, and really to let Richard speak about this wonderful book. So let's, before we talk specifically about some of the stories among the righteous that would be specific to Sefarad, let's talk in general. Richard, tell us how you got here. How did this all start for you?
Yeah, so I think the book, it's an interesting question because there have been different milestones along the way, but if I really had to trace it back, it would be when I was in college, the Holocaust Museum opened on the Mall in Washington, and our family made a pilgrimage, I guess, down there. Nobody in my family, like direct descendants, were affected by the Holocaust. Actually, we've been in the United States for many, many, many generations, but we, like a lot of American Jews, went down to see the exhibit, and anybody who's been through it knows how difficult and enervating an experience that is. As I talk to people about the book, everyone seems to zero in on the same thing I did at the time, which is an exhibit with a pile of shoes of concentration camp victims, many of which are in children's sizes. And that's a very difficult thing, obviously, for anybody to see. And I remember at the time you came out into a small room that was dedicated to people who tried to help, many of whom were what we call the righteous among the nations, which is an award given by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And I remember seeing an exhibit on a group called the White Rose, who were German medical and college students who tried to idealistically foment an uprising against Hitler. They were actually, there's a picture I remember seeing of a young man in a pipe, which is actually on the cover of my book, this actual picture. He's actually considered one of the first people to publicize the Holocaust because they were issuing leaflets. And in the second leaflet, he mentioned that at this point they'd already murdered several 100,000 Jews, and he said, quote, in the most bestial way. And they issued these leaflets all over Germany, and they were people didn't know who they were. They went by the name the White Rose, as I said. And unfortunately, one day they were distributing them at the University of Munich, and they were caught by a maintenance worker who locked the doors. And within days, Hitler personally sent down his handpicked judge to Munich. They were put on trial and executed. And when Sophie Scholl, who was the girl, it was founded by a brother and sister college student, was testifying, she said, everybody believes what we believe. They're just afraid to say it. But unfortunately, that was not the case. Most people did not believe or didn't want to do anything. And so 27,000 or almost 28,000 people have been recognized in Jerusalem by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. And we'll get into some of their stories today, obviously. But, that sounds like a lot of people, but it was in a European population at the time of 500 million. So one way I think is helpful to think about that, and I'm a New Yorker, but you can use your local stadium if you want, but if you took a representative sample of Europe at the time and put them in Madison Square Garden, you would have one person out of the crowd who would be considered a righteous among the nations. So it's a very, very rare thing. And because of that, we can talk about that as well. It was sort of very much overlooked for many years. But on the 75th anniversary of the execution of the White Rose, I wrote an article for the New York Times in their memory on the op-ed page, just sort of using them as an example of what we should all aspire to. And the article went completely viral. It was shared like extremely widely. It trended to one of their top articles. And amazingly to me, there was not one negative comment in any of on the internet we're talking about. So on Twitter, anywhere, nothing. Even with everything going on in the world, with the anti-Semitism. And so I realized that these stories are very inspirational to people. I think they're really important. There have been 40 genocides since World War II, so there's many lessons that we need to learn from them. So I started writing, including the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Daily Beast, and I had a very similar reaction. So that was, and also tries to figure out what is the significance of this and what can we learn from it.
Wonderful. And I would like to speak in general about these one in many thousands and what qualities they shared and how they were unique, and toward the end of our talk to think about that for the future as well. But let's dig in specifically to some of these among the righteous. One that was quite a shock to me, I have to admit, and somebody that I identify, and Isaac mentioned as well in passing, I think of as the great-grandmother of Prince Harry and Prince William, but who numbers among the the righteous is Princess Alice. And so I'd love to hear some words about her and Damaskinos, the Archbishop of Greece, and the Jewish communities there. So if you could maybe key us into that story, please.
Sure. And I thought Isaac's talk was quite helpful and interesting in terms of the background. I'll touch on a few aspects of that as well. I will say, some of you might be aware that there's another book out about a prince named Harry called Spare. And as great as his story might be, and we can debate that, I think his great-grandmother's story is much more interesting. Princess Alice was she was German, but had married into the Greek royal family. So she was a princess of Greece and lived in Athens. I'll back up for 1 second because it is important to understand the Greek Jews and where they were and how that was a difference in their survival. So you really had two groups of Jews in Greece. You had the vast majority of them were Sephardic. And as Isaac mentioned in his talk, they were, in the town, in my book, I call it Salonika because that was the term at the time, but it's Thessaloniki. Before the Treaty of Bucharest, it was under Ottoman control, but was nominally a Jewish city-state. Both Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky had visited and saw this as the future of what eventually became Israel, because you had Jews doing jobs of all kinds, from dock, as Isaac mentioned, dock worker. I mean, the whole town was Jewish. There was a thought actually about making it an independent state. And the local population, which included Muslims and Christians, were willing to have it under Jewish rule. So it was a real place of tolerance. But things went really downhill after the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913, after the First Balkan War, where you had a huge exchange of population between the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims, and the Greeks that were living in what's now Turkey in Asia Minor. And when those Greeks arrived, they brought with them a pretty virulent strain of anti-Semitism. And another thing that is sort of, I think, a little bit unknown is that the Jewish community there was actually quite close to the king. And so when you had over the next number of decades back and forth questions over the monarchy and other kinds of political dynamics in Greece, the Venizelos group, sort of the opposition to the monarchy, also had in it a real strain of anti-Semitism. So that was sort of the backdrop. The other thing to understand is that there were a third kind of Jew, not Ashkenazi or Sephardic, but Romanio, who have been in Greece since Alexander the Great. I actually wrote my thesis at Yale on Alexander the Great, so it was a nice surprise to see the mosaic there. And it was about actually how Alexander and his group were quite tolerant of the Jews and protected them. But these were Jews that were largely in the south. It was a much smaller community. They were in Athens. They were in a lot of the islands. And the Sephardic Jews really had maintained their own cultural identity for a variety of reasons. They spoke Ladino. They were a very distinct community, and they had their own culture, which, by the way, was very different from what the Nazis expected of Jews, and was sort of a shock to them that these people were also Jewish. But the Southern Jews were really very assimilated. They gave their children Greek names. They were very much part of society. There was very little anti-Semitism. People viewed them as their neighbors. They viewed them as Greek first and Jewish second. And so they had, as we'll get into, a very different experience. The other thing that happened in the South versus the North, and this was true in many places throughout Europe, was that it was an Italian occupied zone. And when Greece was occupied by the Axis, it was divided in three. The Italians were in the south. The Bulgarians were in Thrace. That's a whole separate conversation we can get into about the fate of the Bulgarian Jews. But just to summarize it, the local Bulgarian Jews were protected, but the Thracians were deported because Bulgaria wanted Thracian territory. And then in the north, and so Thessaloniki was where the Nazis were. And if you were in an Italian zone, which existed up until 1943 in the fall of Mussolini, when the Germans would occupy the Italian zones, you were generally not rounded up as a Jew. I mean, it was, they didn't do roundups. The Italians kind of thought, they called it the German disease. They thought the anti-Semitism was insane. And so they would not, there was some discrimination, but they would not round up Jews. And at some points were actually quite heroic in protecting Jews. But after 1943, that changed. But Salonika was always a German, occupied place. And so as we, as Isaac talked about, it had the worst survival rate in Europe. 95% of these Jews were wiped out. Again, they had a very distinctive culture. I can actually read for one moment from Primo Levi, who recalled what he's called the admirable and terrible Jews of Salonika, and he wrote actually about them in Auschwitz. He said, these few survivors from the Jewish colony of Salonika, with their two languages, Spanish and Greek, and their numerous activities, are the repositories of a concrete, mundane, conscious wisdom in which the traditions of all the Mediterranean civilizations blend together. Their aversion to gratuitous brutality, their amazing consciousness of the survival of at least a potential human dignity, made of the Greeks the most coherent national nucleus in the lager, and in this respect, the most civilized. And I added that, not surprisingly, they were part of the attempted uprising in Auschwitz on October 7th, 1944, but they were basically all wiped out. So, however, a number of them were able to escape to the south, and I talk about them in the book. And there was a family called the Cohen family, and they had a longstanding connection with the monarchy, and they had hosted the king multiple times in Salonika. And the king had said, they were viewed as friends of the family, and he would see the royal family the father when he was in Athens, and the king actually had said to him, if you ever need anything, like, let us know. Like, we're you are considered friends of the family. And so when the Nazis arrived, the father had just passed away, but he had 4 grown children, 3 boys and a girl, and his widow, and they made their way south to Athens, where Princess Alice lived. Now, Princess Alice was one of the last kind of great royals before World War I sort of decimated monarchies all over the Europe. And monarchy is an interesting, the monarchs, and we can talk about this as well, generally were really good to the Jews. And it's kind of a common theme across Europe. She was a great granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Her wedding was one of the last great weddings of imperial Europe. Her cousin was the Kaiser. Her aunt was the Tsarina Alexandra, the last Tsarina. Another aunt who was married to Grand Duke Sergei, who was part of the Romanov dynasty. He was a horrendous anti-Semite. The wife was a sort of saintly figure. And I mention her because she was really Alice's mentor. And Alice was in Russia when she put to the stone to found an orphanage. And when the revolution happened, Lenin actually, along with the rest of the Romanovs, shot her and threw her down a well and said, virtue with a crown is more dangerous than anything. And she was actually buried in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. And I mention that because it's related to Alice. She was Alice's mentor. And this is why when you see picture, Alice never became a nun, but anybody who watches The Crown sees that she wore a habit, and her mother had a funny line. She said she's the only nun in the world who drinks and plays canasta. But she was a real true royal. And again, her youngest child was Prince Philip, so the father of King Charles. So she's King Charles's grandmother. And she was one of 2 members of the royal family who stayed during the occupation. She ran orphanages. She lost a lot of weight. Ran soup kitchens. I mean, she was a real do-gooder. And this family that I was talking about made their way south. And the three of the 4 sons actually made it to what were called the Free Hellenic Forces, which was sort of the way de Gaulle had the Free French forces. They were an army in exile, and they joined up and were fighting against the Nazis. One of the brothers got caught, sort of not caught by the Nazis, but he got trapped within Greece. And in the meantime, he and his sister and his mother, remembering the promise that the king had made, were able to actually track down Princess Alice, who immediately agreed to hide them in her palace. And she had an apartment on the top floor. And it wasn't even like a sort of Anne Frank situation, people hiding in like a closet. They were, treated as guests. She told her servants that these were her former Swiss nanny and their family. Everyone knew she was lying, but they all kept the secret. And she was literally across the street from the Gestapo. And the Gestapo came, and they had killed a princess for doing something quite similar. They came over and they said to her, is there anything like we can do? Because she also had two daughters that were married to Germans, one of whom was a Nazi. And so they thought she might be sympathetic. After all, she was of German descent. She said, yes, you can do me a favor. You can take your troops out of my country. And she hid this family, for the entire occupation. And then, like many of the righteous, really never told anybody what she did. When she was on her way to Princess Elizabeth's wedding to Prince Philip, she was in Italy and ran into one of the sons who was working for the Greek government in the embassy in Rome, who came to thank her. And she said, like, who had this reality, like, I didn't, I just did what was right. Don't worry, you don't have to thank me. It was my pleasure. And then really never told anyone. And then, years later, her younger brother, Lord Mountbatten, who, again, if you watch The Crown, everyone knows who he is. He was, sort of Prince Philip's, like he kind of raised Philip. He heard it through someone in the Navy. And again, she was very, very modest about it. And when she died, they initially was buried in Westminster, but was at her request moved to Israel and is buried on the Mount of Olives and was honored by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. And Philip and other members of the royal family have gone to pay tribute to her. But she was very heroic, and the story is very unknown, particularly given her prominence. But she basically rescued three Jews in the attic, and at any time, if she'd been discovered, she would have been most likely shot on the spot.
Yeah, and I think that's worth highlighting, that these elites are not protected by titles, whether you're an archbishop or a monarch. This is
in fact, in one of the stories which we may get into, the Habsburg family were particular targets of the Nazis. They sent paratroopers to go after them, and Otto von Habsburg, who was sort of the last in the line, actually rescued quite a number of Jews and really was very focused on making sure the Austrian Jews were protected. And he's mentioned in Mein Kampf, and Hitler hated him like with a passion, and they really tried to go after the royals. And
one of the things we can draw from this particular story of Alice's, before we move on perhaps to another, is this idea of a mentor, because I think that's something you mentioned in your conclusion of your book, that if we can find some commonalities, though that is, has its own risks, you did find, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that a lot of the people who acted had some kind of example of that in their life, or had suffered in childhood a sickness and had been taken care of. And does that make sense to you, that this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking for, I spent a lot of time looking for commonalities, and unfortunately, because of the lack of interest in rescue right after the war, there were not that many studies done the way there were on collaboration or bystanding or perpetration. But the one thing that does stand out which is almost universal, is some figure in early childhood or in your formative years that set an example and taught you to look out for others, and that other people who were different from you were no worse than were the same as you. And so she certainly had that with Duchess Elisabetta.
And her response of that it was a pleasure, is quite amazing. It brings to mind another person in your book. I believe the wife of Sugihara, the diplomat, said, "We were grateful for the opportunity." such an
Yeah.
amazing sentiment to say I was grateful to have been able to put my life at risk of this such a way.
Particularly when some of these people suffered, which was also not the case with Alice, but with others, suffered a great deal for what they did. But they still viewed this as sort of a privilege to have been able to have done to save others.
Amazing. So I have a million questions about that, but I want, in the interest of time, to move on to the Danes, because it's such a fascinating project in terms of the research. I don't know how you did it, and I want to know how you were able to encapsulate the story, because here we're talking about really a nation, an entire country, give or take, united in this project, not just, a 1 in 10,000. So perhaps some background there into the Danish story, and how your entryway into there, and how you were able to frame it in the book.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, most of the stories in my book, I think, are quite unknown. And, people know Schindler and they know Wallenberg. And some people do know the Danish story, because it wasn't unique, actually, in terms of countries that rescued almost all of their Jews. Albania did the same thing, Bulgaria, but it was certainly the largest and probably the most dramatic. And it's pretty unique. So yeah, and I wrote an article a few weeks ago for the Wall Street Journal about community rescue and why it happened and what we can do to create a community that might do that, or certainly would be able to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, which the Danes certainly did. But it is a group story, so I have a few protagonists in it. Isaac mentioned a couple of them, which I'll just give you briefly the story, but it is, again, a story that happened at both the highest political levels as well as everyday people in Denmark. The Jews of Denmark were mostly descendants of, they were mostly Sephardic Jews. The head of the community's last name was Enriquez, and they had been there, though, for quite some time. There were also some refugees that had come there more recently. Religious bigotry was anathema to the Danish people. It had been legally outlawed several centuries earlier. As Isaac mentioned in his presentation, the Jews were invited there. And again, like in the south of Greece, which we can go back and talk about if you'd like, people viewed them as their neighbors and as Danes, and then they happened to be Jewish, right? And it's a remarkable story, because and there were about 7,200 Jews there, and about 8,000 people if you included spouses, right, who were not Jewish. And from the beginning, the Nazis occupied Denmark, kind of virtually without a shot, and they were very focused on not having trouble there, and it was considered an Aryan country. And from the very beginning, the king and the government said, okay, and they were continuing to administrate it. They said, one of the stipulations we have is there will be no discrimination against the Jews. So there's this apocryphal story that the king of Denmark wore, who, by the way, was a relative of Alice, but wore a Star of David. But it's not true, because no Danish Jew was ever forced to wear the Star of David. And so for a couple of years, actually, they were protected. And interestingly, in Denmark, under German occupation, the Nazi equivalent of the Nazi kind of fascist party would regularly get in the elections less than 2%. And the Nazis were not very welcome. And then ultimately, this ended up getting up to Hitler himself, who first he was actually outraged because he had sent a birthday card to the king, very effusive, and the king kind of responded like, thank you, like literally very 3 or 4 words, and he was very outraged by what he viewed as an insult. And anyway, he decided we're over the actually objection of the local Wehrmacht and even parts of the SS to deport the Jews, because the local not Germans they knew this would cause a huge problem locally if they tried to do it. But Hitler insisted, sent some very bad people there, and they were scheduling the roundup for the high holidays because they knew all the Jews would be home. And there happened to be at the in the government, the occupation government, a guy named Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, who was a maritime expert. He was really in love with Denmark and Danish culture. He later became ambassador. He was actually a member of the Nazi Party, sort of like Schindler for opportunistic reasons, but he was not an anti-Semite, and he had Jewish friends. And he was very, very close to the SS officer there because his relations with the Danish government were really good. He was fluent in Danish. They loved him. So he was a source of information and a go-between between the Germans and the Danes. And therefore, he was privy to the fact that this roundup was about to happen. So he first actually tried to prevent it. He flew to Berlin. And when he realized he wasn't going to be able to, he did a couple of things. First, he flew to Sweden and started to make arrangements for, what would happen if the Jews were evacuated. And then he went to the Danish government, and he tipped them off. And he said, there's going to be a roundup of the Jews on Rosh Hashanah, and you need to do something. And the Danish government immediately went into action. They notified the head of the Jewish community. They notified all of their Jewish neighbors, and almost as one, there was a very dramatic moment where the chief rabbi in the synagogue in Copenhagen, the day before Rosh Hashanah, said, there's going to be a roundup. We're not having services tomorrow. Go into hiding. So everyone went into hiding, and virtually the entire country participated. So everything from medical students to and professionals to taxi drivers. Jews were hidden everywhere over a few weeks, and then there was this amazing flotilla that happened, kind of like Dunkirk. Many amateur boats that went ferried the Jews across the straits to Sweden and to safety. And one of the people I talk about in my book was an Olympic rower named Knud Christensen, and he had been in Berlin during the Olympics and been horrified by what had gone on. And his wife had actually studied to be a chef in Berlin and had a similar reaction. And they joined the underground, and he rowed people in his skiff in the first few days back and forth, to safety. And so he's part of my chapter, and his adventure doing that. And we're talking only about
we're talking hours each way, nonstop.
Yes. No, I mean, it was and in the cold. In the end, so there were very few of the Jews were rounded up, and of the 7,200, 500 were captured by the Nazis, and they were sent to Theresienstadt. And the Danes didn't stop there. And what's amazing about it is the Danish government, like almost every week, first of all, they sent food and medicine, and they would call Theresienstadt, and they would protest in Berlin, and they would call, how are the Danish Jews? Are they safe? You better not touch them. And so the Danish Jews stayed in Theresienstadt. The Red Cross came to inspect with Danes. And at the end of the war, buses arrived and took them to Sweden and then eventually back to Denmark. So in the end, about 50 Jews died so it was a 99% survival rate. And the amazing coda to it is many of them went back home. And when they went back home, which was not many places in Europe, people came back and they said, oh, you're back? Because someone had taken their house or their business. They managed their businesses, their neighbors managed their businesses for them. They cleaned their houses, they fed their dogs, they watered their pets, and they welcomed them back with like open arms, and which is also really unique. And so so that was the story of Denmark.
And did you find there was something there? You had mentioned a welcoming culture that stretched back long before this event. Did you find that was important, that there was a culture of hospitality was key to this, or were there other factors that influenced?
Well, there are always other factors, because again, Denmark was a special situation because of the way the Nazis didn't want trouble. But I think in the communities that I studied where this happened, you generally had sort of a widespread, long-standing aversion to bigotry and religious bigotry, and you also had some sort of ethos, whether it was religion or hospitality or some mix of that, that had brought everyone together. And And you also had a culture that was pro-rescue. So even people who weren't going to be, there was an interesting quote in my book. There was a rescuer in Holland, which had sort of a mixed record. But he said, you know, we were the tip of the spear, but what really made a difference was the people around us kind of looked the other way. Whereas in other parts of Europe, people ran to turn you in. So, so yes, but it was, you know, again, a longstanding, you know, view that religious bigotry was anathema, really strong leadership across the board, and a belief that, you know, the Jew, like, again, that the Jews were Jews, but they were also their neighbors and their friends, and they were Danes as well.
And in the case of Dukwitz, also an exemplar there of somebody whose professional life has put him into contact with other cultures and other people from the get-go, right? And that also, I think you found, was something that...
Yes, and he was in a few ways, because he started out in the shipping business. So he was, you know, in an industry where he was dealing with international people. He had friends all over the world. He was actually, when World War II broke out, he was based in New York, and he was transferred back to you know, help with the maritime issues in Copenhagen. So he was sort of a citizen of the world. And again, he had Jewish friends, but he was also someone who had a very distinct moral compass, and he kept a diary. And his diary, I quote quite a lot from. It was fascinating because it was a private diary, and he was writing about why he was doing this. And he, you know, he really, you know, again, it was quite different than pretty much all the other Germans that were there. But yes, as a diplomat, also he was thrown in with lots of other people. Although, you know, diplomats are an interesting story, because on the one hand, they're able to help a lot of people. So you have a number of diplomats that did very large rescues, but as a percentage of diplomats in general, they were also rare, because most diplomats followed orders.
Right, and all the ones you cover are really doing this at great risk. Yes. And paid for it well beyond the end of the war. I mean, for years and decades of feeling professional exile in a sense. Which brings us, and again, this is another one where I have a ton of questions that I want to table, because I want to get some more information out of you. And hear more of what's in the book. One that I think was quite unique is the case of Sousa Mendes, and I think will be of special interest to our group today, who I think was quite interesting in that his rescue almost happened in what felt like a fever, a few days, really. Yeah. That then, I mean, his whole entire life was defined by these, I don't know how many days it was. Almost as if he had gone into a kind of trance and just was at this amazing, almost manic moment. And so maybe if you could give us a little bit of background into Sousa Mendes and the case of what he did in.
Sure. So Aristides de Sousa Mendes he was called in a review of the book, the breakout star of the book. Okay, so he was a Portuguese diplomat. He was an aristocrat. He was a twin, and his brother was the sort of the star. He became the foreign minister. And Sousa Mendes was one of these diplomats that was sort of a bon vivant, who was a great entertainer, and he had amazing people in their home all over the world. He had entertained Einstein, but he was sort of a mid-level consul. He had 14 children. They would fly in front of their home the flags of every place they had children. He was actually at one point the consul in San Francisco, so they had 2 Americans. And he found himself in Bordeaux as consul general in June of 1940, when the Nazis invaded France. And this led to millions and millions of people coming south from Paris down to the south. And the main place people were headed was to try to get into Spain over the Pyrenees. And so you had this unbelievable refugee crisis, and the Nazis were buzzing people with planes and shooting people with machine gun fire. And it was just horrific scenes. And, you know, you had this just worst traffic jam probably in the history of humanity. And the refugees would arrive down in Bordeaux, and there were literally millions of them. And they were going door to door to consulates, including the United States, because you needed a visa to get out. and everyone, including us, slammed the door shut. And this group of refugees ended up outside the Portuguese embassy consulate. And one day, Sousa Mendes went out, and he met a young rabbi from Antwerp, and he also had a large family. And Sousa Mendes said to him, you know, why don't you come in? Because most of my kids I sent back to Portugal. My two oldest are here, but come in with, you know, and spend the night. You don't have to sleep on the street. You have small children. So they went and they spent the night and they spoke for the whole night. And Sousa Mendes at this point had actually, sorry, let me just to back up. The dictator of Portugal, who was a very complicated guy, Salazar, was he was anti-communist and anti-fascist, but he was very focused on neutrality. And what he did not want was for Spain and then Portugal to get pulled into the war. So he had sent very strict orders to all of the diplomats under something called Circular 14, no refugees, particularly no Jews, right? Because they want to upset the Nazis. Franco was next door. So there were strict instructions, and Sousa Mendes had already let a couple in, like before the crisis. So he was already like doing this, kind of violating the order. But this rabbi came, and Sousa Mendes actually told him that he believed, Sousa Mendes was a very, very devout Catholic, but he believed that he was also, and I don't think this is what motivated him, but he was the descendant, he was probably a descendant of conversos. And he knew that, and he knew that in part because both his name and the part of Portugal he was from were areas where there was a lot of converso descendants of conversos. But he said to the rabbi, "Look, let me get visas for you and your family." And the rabbi said to him, "Look, I can't leave all the other Jews here. That would be wrong. I can't, thank you, but I can't accept it." So he went back outside, and Sousa Mendes had this very dramatic moment that you alluded to in front of his family, where he literally took to his bed. He described it later as a nervous breakdown, and he was there for 2 or 3 days. And then he got up and he made this dramatic announcement, and he said, "I'm going to give a visa to any person who wants it, regardless of what your religion is." And so he rescued everybody from the people who wrote Curious George, to Salvador Dali and his wife, to the Habsburg family, the Rothschilds, the art dealer for Picasso and Matisse, Paul Rosenberg, but he also rescued just thousands of very, very poor Jews on the run. And he did this over the course of about 3 weeks before the capitulation of France. And he is considered, they believe that he may have rescued as many as 30,000 people, which means there's hundreds of thousands of people alive today because of him. He was the largest single rescue in the Holocaust by an individual. So, you know, probably order of magnitude 10 to 30 times as many as Oskar Schindler. And then when France fell, as you mentioned, he paid a heavy price. He was summoned back to Lisbon. He was fired. His pension was reduced. He burned through his entire life savings. His children had to leave the country. His wife died prematurely. And then he died prematurely, continuing to contest and say, what I did was the best of Portugal. We're a country of hospitality, and we were neutral, and I made us look good. And he was infuriated because later in the war, actually, Salazar tried to take credit for bringing in because he sort of switched to the Allies. And so Sousa Mendes had this very, very sad ending, where he was like burning the furniture in his house, and he died, penniless in a sort of Franciscan hospital in Lisbon. And then for many years he remained kind of persona non grata, and the United States recognized him before his own country did, but eventually the Portuguese rehabilitated him. They gave him the title of ambassador posthumously, and he's now a hero there, rightfully. But there's just something about him and his sort of the moment he had of crisis and the kindness that he showed, and the speed and the volume of people he saved, that's pretty remarkable. So people seem to be very drawn to his story.
Great, and that's perfect timing because we're at the top of the hour, and it gives us ample time to talk to all of you. The last question from me, I just have to ask because it is something of great professional interest to me, is how did you do this? I mean, we've already just now in 3 of the 10 stories gone from Portugal to Greece and everywhere in between. And this is a truly global a book of yours and a global research project. So could you just tell me, how did you end up completing this research? I mean, how was it even done?
Yeah. Well, my editor pointed out to me at the end, she said, you realize you did like 10 book research because it's 10 different. Yeah. I don't know if I'll do that again, but it was, I mean, it was actually, there are many stories. So the first process was kind of winnowing down which are the 10 to tell, and what the, try to give a different cross section of different types of rescue, what went on in different parts of Europe. I was able to access archives all over the world in, I think, 12 different languages, and taped testimony. And then so it was a big undertaking. I was also able to interview a number of people who were either rescued, mostly as children. And then I had also a really fascinating experience of interviewing a number of the children of rescuers. I probably spoke to 8 or 9 of them. And that was really interesting because it was sort of a mixed verdict on how people felt about their parents who had all done these heroic things. But I think it adds like a little bit of a lot of depth to the book, and also show that you don't have to be a saint to be a hero.
Well, thank you so much for that. I want to step back now and cede the floor so that we can hear questions from the audience.
Okay, here we go. So before we go into the Q&A section, let me just make a couple of announcements, and then we'll come back to the Q&A. First and foremost, I want to thank our guests and of course, Isaac himself, for the intriguing, eye-opening talk that we're having today. I'd like to share with our audience that in addition to these online presentations, we also deliver what I call live on-location events throughout the country and the globe. Our first post-pandemic live presentation already took place at the Bernard Museum of Judaica at Temple Emmanuel in New York City, where the crossroads of SEFARAD, in the footsteps of the crypto Jews mobile exhibit, made its debut back in March, and it was there on display for some 8 months. The mobile exhibit was developed in partnership with the Anna Museum of the Jewish People as part of our ongoing collaborative efforts with them. And I would note that the mobility of the exhibit offers us a unique opportunity to share with the world the legacy of SEFARAD by distributing the exhibit to institutions and organizations around the globe. So be on the lookout when the exhibit arrives to a city near you. Also, I'd like to mention that we have resumed our on-location educational travel programs that bring the Sefarad legacy to life. We have recently completed a very successful Discover Jewish Heritage Tour of Portugal, and by popular demand are offering the next 10-day Portugal Heritage Tour, comes up now on June 6th. We would like for you to know that all of our tours are led by academic experts on the regions that we visit. We would like to thank Dr. Rabbi Peter Tarlow for leading our recent programs to Portugal and Israel. On May 21st, we will operate a 10-day luxury tour to Morocco and a tour to Spain, October 15th. More travel programs will be announced as they become available. For those interested, I ask that you complete or copy the link appearing on your screen and send us your request, and we will respond accordingly. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't ask for your continued support. As you know, we bring you these informative, engaging educational programs year-round, and we do it for free. We ask for your support to allow us to continue providing you with these excellent programming events. And we ask you to please also take a moment to copy or click onto our donation page appearing on the screen. We also would like to invite you and your organization and/or your corporations to sponsor our events. Most importantly, we would like to thank those of you who have and continue to support Jewish Heritage Alliance. Thank you all. And now let's get into the Q&A segment of this program. Back to you, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael and Mark and Richard, for this really incredibly powerful and moving conversation, helping to shed further light on the story of the righteous among the nations, particularly how they relate to Sephardic Jews. Now, you did cover quite a bit of conversation, And I know, Richard, you wanted to bring this up. I'm sure Mark did as well, but again, there's only so much we can cover. But I'd like to go back to Greece and the story of Archbishop Damaskinos, because I find that to be particularly fascinating, as it involves, again, a great story of rescue in Athens and I guess the surrounding environment. So if you could perhaps tell us a little more about him as the Archbishop of Greece, what drove him, what propelled him, and what was the reaction of the Greek Orthodox Church to those efforts?
Yeah, again, this is, I think, a tale of two parts of Greece. So Damaskinos was the Archbishop of Athens, but was therefore nominally the head of the Greek Church. And he was had a very strong personality. Ironically, he was sort of opposed to a strong man named Metaxas, who had been briefly in charge of Greece, who was actually pro-Jewish community. But when Damaskinos, he began to hear, as people were fleeing the Salonika, what was going on, and he was pretty horrified by it. And he and large members of the civil society, protested. And there's actually an interesting anecdote about him where he was summoned by Jürgen Stroop, who had been the man who had liquidated the Warsaw Ghetto. And he demanded, he would make demands of him, including to turn over the list of all of the Jews. And he threatened to shoot him. And Damaskinos, without missing a beat, handed over a noose and a rope and said, if you're gonna kill me, hang me, because that happened to my predecessor 300 years ago, and respect our traditions. And the Nazis didn't even know how to react to him. So he was quite a brave and courageous and a strong leader. And when the Nazis arrived in Athens, right after the Italians left, they wanted to do a roundup. And Damaskinos, when they summoned the chief rabbi to try to get all the Jews to come together, the first person he went to was Damaskinos, who was his friend. And Damaskinos helped the chief rabbi escape, and which was also meant to be a signal to the rest of the Jewish community to go underground. And then he issued orders to all of the clergy to do whatever they can all over Greece to protect Jews, hide them. A number of them lost their lives doing so. And then he worked very closely. So there was a very famous letter that he signed, which also was signed by probably 40 members of civil society, that from the head of the Actors Union to the head of the Chemists Guild. He was the first signature, both to the collaborationist prime minister, as well as to the head German, protesting the treatment of the Jews, saying the Jews are our neighbors. You promised you wouldn't touch them. They fought for our country. They're Greek. And he became, doing so, the only head of a church, an organized church in Europe, to formally protest the Holocaust. And then he worked very closely with a lot of the people in the government, including the chief of police of Athens. And he would issue fake baptismal certificates, and the city government would issue fake name, people's names, not Jewish names, and false aliases. And they saved thousands of Jews doing that. And then his message also traveled. So one of the places that I talked about where there was 100% rescue was the island of Zakynthos, which is in the Ionian Sea, where there were 200 Jews. And when they arrived for the roundup, they summoned the mayor, and he went to get to the local metropolitan, who was very much inspired by Damaskinos. And the Germans had asked for a list of the Jews, and the two of them went back to the commandant, and they've been recognized as righteous for this, handed him a list, piece of paper. And they said, here's the list of Jews you required. And on it, there were two names, their own, the mayor and the metropolitan. And he was, directly inspired by Damaskinos. So Damaskinos later became actually like briefly the prime minister of Greece. He was on the cover of Time magazine, but not well known, given how bad it was in where most of the Jews in Greece, that there was this heroism going on in the South. And that, again, the Greek Orthodox Church, despite the fact that the Greek Jews in Salonika were basically wiped out, is, again, the only head of a church that formally protested the Holocaust. So he was a great, humanitarian and a great leader. And he also has been recognized as righteous.
Yeah, fascinating. You mentioned briefly, you touched on the idea of commonalities between the righteous, have there been studies that are conducted that identify, again, some of these key character traits? I mean, again, you touched on some type of religious background, perhaps, or loving support, right? Moral support from, I guess, a support system. So are there studies that shed light on this phenomenon? I guess you probably, was it called the altruistic personality? But also I'm curious, do you see commonalities from a national perspective? We have some questions about Bulgaria proper. You did mention that, and Morocco. And so do you see commonalities between perhaps these kingdoms that also largely, it seems, saved their Jewish communities?
Well, I think there's no question. So those are a couple different questions. And individuals, I think there are some commonalities. Again, I think the single biggest one was having this role model as a child. And also a couple of other things that would related to that. They were often people who had very high self-esteem, which often goes back because they had to be willing to make decisions against the grain. And then I think also there was definitely correlation with like being in a creative profession or being around a lot of international people. And I definitely think very much a belief in something greater than yourself. For some people that was political, some people it was cultural, an ethos. For most people it was religion, and it was generally, whether it was Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, it was people who really took the teachings to heart more than external displays of piety. So there's a Protestant village in France that saved 5,000 people, 3,500 Jewish children. They had over the temple, love thy neighbor. So I think, people who really internalized those beliefs as, and really had great faith, that more than anything was probably the single biggest saver of Jews were those kinds of, teachings, the parable of the Good Samaritan, love thy neighbor as thyself, etc. I think for group rescue, as I said earlier, it was generally a mix of things that came together, where you had a long-standing tradition, like in Albania, which was the only majority Muslim country. Jews, Christians, and Muslims had lived there since the Roman times together. The ambassador at the time, who was Jewish to Albania for FDR, said at the time, this is the only country in Europe with no religious bigotry. And they also had an ethos called Beza, which was extreme hospitality, where they would rather die than turn over a guest. And one of the righteous Muslims there said that his father, the brothers, they said their father had taught them a knock on the door as a message, is a gift from God. So having this longstanding tradition of, tolerant, not just tolerance, but actually kind of neighborliness and like viewing the other people as, their neighbors and their friends, and being willing to protect them. And the other thing that is very clear is when the whole country was willing to come together as one, right? They were able to stop the Nazis, which is why I think people make fun of this anti-bullying stuff, but actually it starts with children. And if you have if the majority believes something's wrong, if you stand up and say, no, that person's being, treated wrong, and the whole, more than, most people agree with you, that's the kind of place where you had this kind of rescue. I'll just touch briefly on monarchy. I do think monarchies tended to be better. And I think to the extent that the monarch was able to stay in control. So, I wrote an article about the King of Morocco for the LA Times, and he was very young. The Sultan at the time actually wasn't yet the king, came with independence title. He stood up to Vichy, and he had this great comment where he said there are no Jews in Morocco, there are only Moroccans. And so he was able to protect the entire Jewish community there. And Bulgaria is a complicated. I debate with Abe Foxman about Bulgaria a little bit, because what happened in Bulgaria itself was amazing. I think it's less actually there to do with the king, who was put under pressure by the church. So again, the Orthodox Church there, and some of the government, and in particular the sort of deputy head of the parliament, put enormous pressure on the Bulgarians, and they did in fact prevent the Jews of Bulgaria from being rounded up. The sort of asterisk taint on them, unfortunately, is that when they were the occupying power in Greece, in Thrace, which is sort of an ancestral homeland for the Bulgarians, they wanted the territory, and so as part of the kind of ability to negotiate with the Nazis, they turned over the Thracian Jews. So Bulgarians protected their own Jews, but not, the Jews where they occupied, which was not the other communities we're talking about protected Jews wherever they were. So that is, but Bulgaria, that said, was significantly better than a lot of other countries.
Right. No, absolutely. It's yeah, some of these they're not simple black and white. There's a lot of gray and and mixture in between. Another question is, some of these righteous, of course, are famous, and you've of course noted that, such as Oskar Schindler, obviously Raoul Wallenberg has gotten much more prominence. What do you think it will take for some of these others? I mean, obviously you're playing a part by writing the book, by talking about it, but some of these other heroic figures, including Susan Mendes, who saved 30,000 people or so, and even the Archbishop and Princess Alice. I mean, what does it take for someone to become recognized at such an extremely high level in public consciousness? Does it take a Hollywood film directed by a famous director?
Well, my agent's working on that. I mean, people can buy the book and read it, and I hope actually it gets to children, because I think that rescue is really important also as a way of introducing even the Holocaust to people who, it's very difficult when you start, I think, not just with children, but with the real horror of what happened. So it's a way of, I think, entering people in and getting towards and then telling that story. I think, look, I mean, to me, there's a historical injustice that everyone forget, Wallenberg. I mean, it's great that but the fact that everyone knows who Heinrich Himmler is. Everyone knows who Adolf Hitler is. Everyone knows who Hermann Goering is. People don't know about Damaskinos or Aristides de Sousa Mendes or any of these people. So I think it's part of it is our culture and what we focus on. We don't focus on stories of good. I mean, there are people who are doing really heroic things right now in terrible places, including Ukraine, but we don't focus on that as much. And so I think that's a cultural problem we have in the United States. It's probably a human nature thing. They were overlooked for many years for maybe some understandable reasons, because the first generation of survivors didn't want a focus on rescue because they thought it would sort of distort the record, and also many of them had been in camp, so they were not rescued. It was the children that, when they sort of got older, started to focus more on this. But they're like mini projects going on. I know they're trying, we're trying to get Princess Alice more known, but there's a project to get her sanctified, canonized in a Greek Orthodox church. I know Charles is very interested in the story because it's his grandmother. There's in one of my favorite chapters is about a Tour de France winner. He's one of the most famous athletes in Italy, Gino Bartoli. There's an effort to get him canonized. There was with the diplomats, actually, there was a resolution put into Congress 3 weeks ago that I think will get done, that will give the Congressional Gold Medal to 40 diplomats, including only one American who's in my book, Hiram Bingham. So it's things like that. But yeah, I think to reach the mass consciousness, you probably do need film. So we're working on some projects. There's a Netflix series that's going to come out in a few months about a story I tell that was actually in the Ken Burns story for about 5 minutes about Bingham and Varian Fry. So hopefully, if that does well, there'll be more interest in rescue. But I also think the most important thing is to teach these stories in schools. I think that's really important. I mean, my daughter, when she was in middle school, there was a great children's book about the Danish rescue called Number the Stars. And, and she goes to a secular school, and everyone read it. And I think that's really, it's really important because, again, it brings up a whole conversation about the Holocaust and what happened. But at the same time, it has a message of goodness and sort of, honoring people that were, again, very rare in what they did, but among the greatest heroes in the history of mankind who were just completely overlooked. But yeah, that is one of the reasons. I mean, that was the primary driver for me writing the book. There's a Jewish value of gratitude, and I feel like whether our individual families were there or not, we all owe. I mean, humanity owes them, but certainly the Jewish community owes them a debt of gratitude, and which is why actually, in Israel, from the founding of Yad Vashem, and you quoted the Golda Meir, that's been part of the mission, is to honor the righteous. And the title of my book, The Garden of the Righteous, is the place in Yad Vashem where every time somebody gets the honor, they plant a tree, and it's now like a kind of a forest, and it's quite beautiful. But that was one of the 4 or 5 core missions of Yad Vashem from its get-go.
Yeah, Mark, I'm sorry, did you?
I just wanted to say that I think, to put a finer point on one of the things that Richard says, we do also have to acknowledge that there was an entire generation, at least, of silence from the people who were active doing the things that we're trying to remember. They themselves did not want to speak about it.
Yes.
And so while it is human nature, and yes, there are some, sad ways of looking at this, I think we're also just hopefully at the beginning, and that each subsequent generation gets to choose what is important to them historically. The material is there, the archives are there. You have to dig, you have to look, you have to want to do it. And I think, hopefully Richard is part of a wave of things that we can see in the future.
I mean, that's a very good point, Mark. I mean, the thing I also saw, is like people love these stories, actually. I mean, like, they're fascinated by them. There's a reason Schindler's List is so beloved as a film, right? And as a, both commercially and critically. And the other thing is, Mark brings up a very good point, which is that many of these rescuers were very reticent to say what they did. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Most of it was, I think, a true modesty. They didn't really feel like they did anything that was extraordinary. They would, like, the language in thousands of these stories is almost identical. Like, I just did what any decent person would do. I just, I didn't do anything heroic. I don't understand this. There was also, in a lot of cases, the fact that we have to remember there was still real anti-Semitism after the war. Oskar Schindler had rocks thrown at him. He got in litigation because somebody called him like a Jew lover, and he hit the guy, and then he had to pay the guy a fine. I mean, it was people, when they came back, people would say, why did you do this? And also, you could have gotten us all in trouble, or like, why were you like the Jews? And then Behind the Iron Curtain was a separate story where, there was real institutionalized anti-Semitism. If you were a rescuer, you could go to jail, you could be killed. It often meant you worked with the Allies, which was, you were an anti-communist. So you had people who were, had the righteous metal in their drawers, and they never wanted to say anything until the wall fell. I mean, one woman in my book, she rescued 2,500 small children, and she was honored in the early 60s. The Polish government wouldn't let her go get not only would they not let her go to Israel to get the medal, they wouldn't let her, then they decided, when they found out, they wouldn't let her children go to university. And they kind of like ruined her life for a while. And so if you were, in Lithuania or Poland or Ukraine, and you did this, it was something you didn't want to tell anybody about. It was dangerous. So we for many reasons, we lost, decades of these stories.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's so important to promote and to educate. Where Elie Wiesel has the famous quote that neutrality never benefits the oppressor; it only benefits the oppressed. And
he, as you probably know, was a big proponent of honoring the righteous.
Yeah. I got one more question here, because it looks like we're coming to the end of our time. So the question is about the Cohen family, but I think I'd like to broaden it, because the question is, do you know how many Cohen descendants there are today? And so I think we can kind of extrapolate to say, you mentioned, again, Susan Mendes saved 30,000 people, so there are hundreds of thousands living due to him. Do we have any idea how many people are living today in 2023 who are descended from people saved by the righteous among the nations?
Oh, it's a lot. I don't know. I mean, I at one point did try to do a mathematical exercise that got me, for the people, just the 10 stories I told, is somewhere between, probably 500,000 and 1 million. But, that's because some of them were mass rescues. I also have a story about 10 people who saved one girl. I can say this, which is pretty, I mean, there are fascinating parts of that question. I mean, there's all kinds of famous people who really impacted the world that were either saved or descendants of people who were saved. And you see there, like, I mean, the entire cultural, kind of like center of the world move from Europe to the US. But I've had the experience, like, when I've written about these people, and this happens to me quite a lot now, I will not only get emails from people who say to me, well, my family was saved by this person, and therefore I'm alive because of this person, but I will inevitably get somebody I know that I had no idea was saved. Sugahara, the Japanese diplomat. I mean, I now know 4 or 5 people that I personally knew that are actually alive today because of him, that I had no idea until I wrote about him that they were his descendants. So, you know, and then of course, you know, as this goes on, it's exponential, right? So with each generation, it's more and more people. And that's where, you know, when they say as you mentioned earlier, you save one life, you save the whole world. That's part of it, right? Is one person and then their descendants and then their descendants. And, you know, that's why what the impact these people have will be around forever.
Yeah, exactly. And so here, just to, I guess one final question, but very brief. If people are interested, obviously, I encourage everyone to get the book. I have my own copy going through it, but are you going on any book tours to promote the book in the United States?
Yes, I'm happy to, if anybody wants me to come somewhere, let me know. I've been doing a series of events. So I was, you know, we kicked it off at Temple Emmanuel. I'll be speaking at the Roosevelt House on Tuesday in New York. I was in Miami and Palm Beach last week and Washington, but there'll be a series of events. I'm going to speak at the 92nd Street Y in early May. But I'm very interested in talking to people about the book. So if anybody would like to do an event, I'd welcome it, because to your point, how do you get the stories out there? You know, it's talking about them and talking about the book. And I find each conversation is actually a little bit different, right? So we spend a lot of time today on Greece and Denmark, and other people have other parts of, you know, other stories that are important to them. And, you know, I think, again, I spoke at Yale, you know, so speaking to children and adolescents and people who are, you know, the next generation that actually can make a difference, you know, I think is really important also. So there should be, you know, there'll hopefully be more conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, ladies and gentlemen. So Richard and Mark, thank you for being in conversation for all of us. And Hugo, thank you for your opening remarks. And everyone, thank you for joining the webinar today. Truly incredible, far-reaching. And again, these people are drops of love in an ocean of poison whose effects will endure until the end of time. So that's it from us. Michael, back to you.
Well, in closing, again, I just want to thank Richard, Mark, yourself, and our audience for making this event a success. It was remarkable. I think it was an eye-opener for a lot of us. Our next planned event, for those who are listening, is for the end of March. So be on the lookout for the announcement. But for now, again, thank you all, and goodbye for now.